God, amen. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 11. It's 34 verses. Let's start. Verse 1, imitate me just as I also imitate Christ. And 2, now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. On verse 1, St. Clement says, if you imitate Paul as he imitated Christ, then you will be imitating Christ as he represented. This is perhaps the second time he says that in 1 Corinthians. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things, and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. Having attacked their mortals, and behavior, Paul now goes on to correct their traditions. And again, St. John Chrysostom says the Corinthian women used to pray and to prophesy, for in those days women also prophesied, with their heads bare. Meanwhile, the men who had spent a long time in philosophy wore their hair long and covered their heads when praying, which was a Greek custom. Paul had already admonished them about these things. It seems that some had listened to him, but that others disobeyed. Here he praises the obedient before going on to correct the others. And that's going to be the next topic that he is going to discuss with them. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. The Father is rightly called the head of Christ because he begat him, but Christ is head of a man in one way, and man is head of a woman in another, and God is the head of Christ in yet another. God is the head of Christ because Christ was begotten of him. Christ is the head of the man because he created him, and the man is the head of the woman because she was taken from his side. Christ is the head of a man because Adam was created by him out of nothing. Thus, one expression has different meanings according to the difference of person and substance. And again, St. John Chrysostom on the same verse says the word head is used in two different senses here, since otherwise absurdity would result. The distance between Christ and man is far greater than between man and woman on the one hand, or between Christ and God on the other, and is of a different kind. Christ and God are equal in substance, but different in relationship, and the same applies to man and woman. But between God and Christ, the Son, on the one hand, and man and woman on the other, there's a vast difference of substance as well as of relationship. Now we're going to move on to from verse 4 to verse 16 on the next batch of verses. So verse 4 says, every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and the glory of God, But woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but woman from man. Nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. For this reason the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman. But all things are from God. Judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone seems to be contentious we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. We're going to kind of go through and unpack these verses. Verse 4, every man praying or prophesying having his head covered dishonors his head. Severian says, here talking about praying and prophesying, there's a difference between ancient and recent prophets as follows. The ancients prophesied about the redemption of Israel, the calling of the Gentiles, and the incarnation of Christ. Whereas recent prophets prophesy about particular things or people, as Peter prophesied about Ananias, for example. And then verses 5 to 7, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. Here from Ambrose, speaking about these three verses, he says, although man and woman are of the same substance, the man has priority because he is the head of the woman. He is greater than she by cause and order, not by substance. The woman is inferior to the man because she is part of him, for her origin is in the man. She was created out of him, and for that reason a woman is under obligation to her husband and is subject to his control. Paul says that the honor and dignity of a man makes it wrong for him to cover his head, because the image of God should not be hidden. Indeed, it ought not to be hidden, for the glory of God is seen in the man. Then he continues, there is an enormous distance between the glory of God and the glory of man. For a man is formed in the likeness of God, and woman is not. She is the likeness of God because of the man. God created only one human being, so that just as all things come from one God, all human beings come from one man. And then the next couple of verses, verse 8, 9, and 10. Verse 8 says, for man is not from woman, but woman from man. Nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. St. John Chrysostom says, being covered is a mark of subjection and authority. It induces the woman to be humble and to preserve her virtue. For the virtue and honor of the governed is to dwell in obedience. And Ambrose says, the veil signifies power, and the angels are bishops, as it says in the book of the Revelations of John. A woman, therefore, ought to cover her head, because she is not the likeness of God, but is under subjection. Because transgression began with her, she ought to indicate this by covering her head in church out of reverence for the bishop. Nor should she speak because the bishop takes the place of Christ in front of him, and because he is the representative of Christ, she ought to appear as she would before a judge, as one under subjection, because of the way the sin of which we are guilty originated. And then let's move on forward up to verse 16. Verse 11 says, nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. Having talked about the glory of the man, Paul now reestablishes the balance so as not to exalt the man beyond what is due, nor to oppress the woman. In the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. Each one of the two is the cause of the other, God being the cause of all. And then that's pretty much what this verse says. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman, but all things from God. St. John Chrysostom says, this confirms what I have already said, that both are one in nature, because the origin of woman is man, and in Genesis we read that he was made by the Lord the Creator. After expounding particular details step by step, Paul adds that all things are from God, in order that everything might be subject to him, and that the notion of a single first principle may be kept in mind. His purpose here is twofold. that the woman will not be upset because of her state of subjection, and two, that the man will not be proud, imagining that he has some exalted position. In verse 3, judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Now we see why Paul censured the Corinthians with irony back at the beginning of the chapter. Coming back to the question that he's discussing. It was the church's tradition for women to be veiled, to have a cover over their head. But since the Corinthians were ignoring it, Paul made his appeal not to the authority of tradition, which they had disregarded, but to the argument from nature and what he says is right. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. Naturally, Paul means that it is honorable and practically compulsory for a woman to be veiled when making amends and giving thanks to God. Long hair is a symbol of veiling, which appears as a voluntary addition to nature. Not unveiled women ever obtains any. No unveiled woman ever obtains any authority. And 16, but if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. Simply he's wrapping up saying, this is not just my teachings, this in fact, this is a shared teaching among all the churches of God, not only just to the Corinthians. The next batch of verses from verse 17, now in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you come together, not for the better, but for the worse. For first of all, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry, and another is drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and to drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you. So verse 17, now in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse. St. John Chrysostom is saying, Paul recognized that the Corinthians, instead of growing closer, were falling into habits of the world, so they needed a rebuke from him in order that they might return to the former state. Verses 18, 19, for first of all, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, in part I believe it. For there must be also factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you. So here he's talking about when you come together, the celebration of the Eucharist always followed the agape meal the or the meal of the offerings that used to be offered. Every person used to bring offerings to the church according to their ability, and supposedly these offerings should have been shared by everyone. But in fact, what St. Paul is finding out here is when he says, "Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat. It is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry, and another is drunk. What, do you not have houses to eat in, and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you." So what used to happen is people used to eat what they offered. So they come bring an offer, and then they sit down to eat what they brought in, not sharing it with others. And those who didn't have felt shame because they couldn't partake. And then the offerings were not being shared by the congregation. This is what St. Paul is talking to them about. The next couple of verses, for I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and said, Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you drink this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. So going over these verses, it is very beautiful that St. Paul records the words of the Lord as also recorded in the Gospel, as are the same words that are being prayed in every church during liturgy as well. And then, verse 25, in the same manner he also took the cup and said, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink in remembrance of me." Quite similar to the words of our liturgy. Verse 26, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes." Here, St. Cyril says, proclaiming the death according to the flesh of the only begotten Son of God, that is, of Jesus Christ, and confessing his resurrection from the dead and his ascension to the heaven. We celebrate the unbloody sacrifice in the churches, and we thus approach the spiritual blessings and are made holy, becoming partakers of the holy flesh and of the precious blood of Christ, which also we say in our liturgies. Finally, the last couple of verses we can go over it without any commentary because they're quite straightforward. So verse 27 says, "Therefore, whoever eats this bread, which is the communion, or drinks this cup to the Lord, is in an unworthy manner, will be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. For this reason many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. For if we could judge ourselves, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we are chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned with the world. Therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. But if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, lest you come together for judgment, and the rest I will set in order when I come." So here St. Paul kind of sets in order their how they handle themselves during prayers. The man should not have his head covered, but the woman should have her head covered, and he explains the reason. And then after that, he talks to them about another issue which they were having, which was how they were not sharing the meal with love after communion. And so he says, "Him who's hungry, let him eat at home, but come in the church, we offer everything that is offered between those who are poor, those who are rich, those who brought, those who have, and those who don't have." And then he also says, when we come to communion, let each person examine himself prior, and let no one partake of the body and the blood of Christ without being worthy to do so. So here, wrapping up this chapter, chapter 11, and God willing, we'll continue next week.